A harsh metallic crash erupted as the sable and ash German Shepherd slammed itself against the kennel door, the whole truck shaking under its panic. It had just torn into an officer's arm, and the euthanasia order was issued on the spot. But right then, a pickup rolled to a sudden halt, its engine dying mid-rumble. The man who stepped out, someone who hadn't stopped for anyone in 6 years, froze completely. His face turned pale as he stared at the dog. He wasn't seeing a crazed animal. He was recognizing the same signal he'd witnessed once before, seconds before a bomb tore through a house in Afghanistan. Before we begin, tell us where you're watching from. And if this story touches your heart, please subscribe for more. A cold October rain draped Portland in a silver-gray veil, soft enough to blur the streets but heavy enough to soak through the spirit of anyone passing by. Evan Carter walked alone beneath it, a tall, broad-shouldered man in his mid-30s whose presence made strangers instinctively step aside, not because he appeared dangerous, but because there was something withdrawn, something brokenly distant in the way he moved. His dark hair, once kept in the razor-sharp discipline of a Navy SEAL, now curled slightly at the ends from weeks without a cut. A short, coarse beard framed his strong jawline, giving him the look of a man both rugged and worn. His eyes, steel blue, unwavering even in the rain, were the only trace of the disciplined warrior he once was. Those eyes held a quiet storm no one else could see, a storm stirred awake whenever thunder, sirens, or sudden motion scraped against old scars he tried to bury. He wore a faded gray hoodie under a weather-resistant jacket, the kind outdoor workers favored, and a pair of old cargo pants tucked into black combat boots that had marched through deserts and alleys far from this quiet corner of the Pacific Northwest. 6 years ago, he had left the teams, left the Brotherhood, left the battlefield, and hid himself in Portland like a ghost who hadn't been invited back to the living. But that morning, he had simply planned to buy coffee and groceries, then retreat to his rented basement apartment where silence felt safer than conversation. Fate intervened halfway down Hawthorne Boulevard. Ahead of him, parked beside the curb outside an animal control van, stood Officer Mark Holloway, a stout man in his early 40s. Mark wore a soaked Navy uniform and a plastic rain poncho that clung awkwardly to his stocky body. His reddish-brown mustache drooped in the rain, making him look tired, irritated, and underpaid. He wasn't cruel, just exhausted by a job that demanded daily decisions he wished belonged to someone else. His face, round and freckled, tightened with frustration as he wrestled with a metal cage. Inside the cage was a German Shepherd, large, gray and black, perhaps 4 or 5 years old, its fur matted by rain and fear. The dog's name was scrawled on a tag: Ranger. Ranger was impressive in size, with strong shoulders, a thick neck, and a tail stiffened in sheer panic. But what struck Evan wasn't the dog's body. It was the way it moved violently, yet without intention. Ranger flung himself against the cage walls again and again, claws scraping metal with a desperate rhythm. The dog's golden-brown eyes were wide, whites showing all around the irises, pupils blown with that ancient, primal terror animals get only from remembering something they cannot forget. Mark grumbled through the noise. "Settle down, buddy. Damn it. They told me you were a tough one." His tone wasn't unkind, just resigned, as if he knew he was moments away from doing something that would darken his conscience for the rest of the week. Next to Mark stood Sarah McKinley, a petite woman in her early 30s with fair skin, a long dark ponytail plastered to her neck by the rain, and glasses fogging with every sharp breath she took. Sarah was an animal shelter tech, gentle by nature, soft-spoken, someone who felt deeply. You could see it in the way she held her clipboard like a shield, knuckles pale, trying to steady herself. She wasn't built for cruelty, she was built for care, and the thought of what was about to happen gnawed at her. "Officer Holloway," Sarah said shakily, "he's not acting aggressive. He's terrified. I've seen aggressive dogs. This isn't that. There has to be another option." Mark sighed, shaking his head. "City says this one already bit someone last night. Deep bite. Protocol's protocol." The rain thickened. Ranger slammed the cage again. Evan's jaw tightened without him realizing it. Something ancient stirred in him. Not the instinct to fight, but the instinct to understand. Because he recognized that gaze. He had seen it before, on a different continent, in a different life. Ranger wasn't looking at the humans. He wasn't focused on the cage. Instead, every few seconds, the dog's head jerked up to scan the sky. Ragged breaths slicing the air, ears pinned so tightly they nearly vanished into his coat. He wasn't expecting danger from the ground. He was expecting it from above. Evan felt his stomach turn. The rain smelled suddenly like burning sand again. His mind, despite 6 years of forced silence, played the scene he never escaped. Fallujah, the sky trembling from incoming rockets, his canine partner, Ghost, freezing mid-step, not to fight, but to warn. The exact same posture, the exact same terror. He didn't realize he had stopped walking until Sarah looked up and noticed him. "Sir, are you okay?" Her voice was shaky, but kind. Evan blinked slowly, grounding himself. "That dog," he said, voice low, rough from disuse, "isn't violent. He's anticipating a threat." Mark frowned. "And who exactly are you, pal?" Evan hesitated. He had spent 6 years refusing to say it out loud, refusing to acknowledge a past that tore pieces from him. "Former Navy SEAL," he murmured, eyes locked on Ranger. "Worked K-9 deployments." Mark blinked, taken aback. Sarah's face softened with a hope she didn't dare express. Evan stepped closer, rain dripping from his hood. Ranger responded instantly, barking, lunging, smashing into the cage wall as if the world were ending. But Evan didn't flinch. He didn't even look directly at the dog. His gaze drifted upward, just like Ranger's, scanning the gray clouds. "He's not attacking," Evan said quietly. "He's remembering." Mark shifted uncomfortably. "Look, man, that might be true, but I have orders. We're taking him in for euthanasia," Evan finished, voice flat. Sarah flinched as if the word slapped her, and Evan knew right then that he could walk away. He could buy his coffee, disappear into his apartment, pretend he hadn't seen the past staring back at him from a cage in the rain. But the truth pressed into his ribs with a painful certainty. He had already abandoned one partner. He would not abandon another. Without another word, Evan stepped fully into the chaotic scene, rain sliding off his hood like a veil lifting from a man who'd spent too long hiding. His pulse steadied, his breath slowed, and the ghost of Fallujah whispered behind his ribs, "Not this time." He stepped toward the cage. The rain softened to a distant murmur on the metal roof of the isolation wing, becoming less a downpour and more a steady heartbeat echoing through the dim corridor. Evan Carter walked inside with the same slow, deliberate steps he once used clearing tight alleyways in Fallujah. He carried only 2 things: an old wooden chair whose legs were uneven from age, and a paperback novel softened at the corners, as worn out as the man holding it. The cramped quarantine room was lit by fluorescent bulbs that hummed faintly, casting a pale glow on the concrete floor and metal kennels. The air smelled faintly of disinfectant and wet fur. Ranger waited inside his enclosure, shoulders tight, body coiled, eyes bright with an unspoken panic that seemed ready to ignite again. Evan placed the chair at his usual distance, 3 meters, and sat sideways, avoiding the threat of direct eye contact. He opened his book, though he didn't read it. The pages were merely a shield, a ritual, a signal of harmless presence. Ranger's breathing was ragged at first. Each inhale shivered through his chest. But his lunges toward the bars were weaker now, less frantic, as if each day had slowly chipped away at the edges of a terror too long held. "Easy, Ranger," Evan murmured, though it was hardly more than breath. The dog did not understand the words, but he understood tone. Calm, steady, unshaken. The kind of quiet a soldier might cling to in the middle of a firefight. As Evan sat, he became aware of another person standing nearby. Sarah McKinley hovered by the wall, her petite frame tense but hopeful. Her wet ponytail from earlier had dried into loose waves, softening her oval face. She still clutched her clipboard to her chest, fingers pale as she watched. Her fear wasn't of Ranger. It was of failure, of seeing yet another creature she cared about slip through the cracks of a system that moved too fast and judged too easily. "He's calmer today," she whispered. "That's you. He knows you're not here to hurt him?" "He knows I'm waiting," Evan replied quietly. "Sometimes that's enough." Sarah smiled faintly. "You talk like someone who's lived more than one life." "Just one," Evan said, jaw tightening, "but it feels like two." Before Sarah could respond, the door opened and a tall man in his late 20s stepped in carrying a worn first aid kit. This was Tom Reyes, the evening veterinary assistant. He had a lean build, olive-toned skin, and short dark hair cropped neatly at the sides. His jaw was sharp, his nose slightly crooked, a souvenir from a high school boxing match he lost in one punch. Tom rarely smiled, not out of rudeness but because he lived with a constant low-level anxiety about doing things wrong. He wasn't built for chaos, he was built for procedures, guidelines, neat lists. "Evening," Tom said with a slight nod, eyes darting between Evan, Ranger, and Sarah. We had a note from the supervisor. The dog's still marked as high-threat class. Shouldn't be anyone inside the room alone with him." "I'm not inside," Evan said calmly, "and I'm not interfering." Tom exhaled through his nose, clearly battling between protocol and the evidence before him. "He's different with you around." "He's remembering," Evan answered softly, turning a page without reading it. "That's the hard part." Ranger's growling had faded into a low, uncertain whine. The dog lay down, chest still rising and falling too quickly, but his eyes watched Evan, not with rage, but with confusion, as though he recognized something in the man's posture, the angle of his shoulders, the slow movements. The third day was always the turning point in canine decompression, at least for combat dogs. Evan had learned that well. On the first day, fear ruled. On the second, confusion. On the third, recognition flickered, like a dying ember catching a breath of air. The ember sparked when Evan spoke. "Sits." The word was instinctive, whispered, German syllables flowing from a place deep beneath memory's rubble. Ranger jerked upright as though struck by lightning. His ears snapped forward. His trembling eased for one suspended second. Tom's mouth fell open. Sarah covered her lips with her hand, eyes wide. "Was that?" "A command he used to know," Evan said quietly, "a piece of his old world." Ranger didn't obey, he wasn't ready, but the reaction was loud enough, visible enough to confirm the truth. This was no ordinary shelter dog. Whatever had broken Ranger had not destroyed the soldier carved into him. Evan exhaled slowly, letting silence reclaim the space. A minute passed, then another. Finally, footsteps echoed down the hallway. The door swung open, revealing Dr. Malcolm Carter, no relation to Evan, just coincidence. Dr. Carter was a tall, barrel-chested man in his late 50s with white hair swept back in a style that hinted he once cared about appearances, before exhaustion became permanent. He wore rectangular glasses that always seemed to sit slightly crooked on his wide nose. His voice, when he spoke, carried the weight of someone who had delivered thousands of diagnoses, most of them unwelcome. "Evening, all," Dr. Carter said, his tone neutral as he scanned the room. "I came to check the file updates. Our danger case still giving trouble?" His eyes landed on Ranger and then on Evan sitting impossibly calm across from him. "And who might you be?" Evan stood slowly, not out of respect but out of old habit. "Evan Carter, civilian, former SEAL." The doctor raised an eyebrow. "We don't usually have Tier 1 assets doing behavioral work in the quarantine wing." "Just sitting," Evan said. "That's all." Dr. Carter folded his arms, studying Ranger with a gaze shaped by decades in veterinary emergency. "Dog's been through hell," he said at last. "Eyes don't lie. Dogs, like him, they don't break like pets do. They shatter like soldiers." Evan nodded once. "He's seen something from above," he said, voice low. "Mortar fire, drone blasts, IEDs, something burned into him." Dr. Carter sighed. "Well, whatever he's seen, the city doesn't care. There's a 5-day behavioral evaluation window. If there's no improvement, they'll push for termination. Liability and all." Sarah's face fell. Tom swallowed hard. Evan didn't react. He had expected something like this. Systems didn't have patience for slow healing. But he did. "He'll come around," Evan said firmly. "He just needs space to remember who he is." For the next hour, Evan remained in place. Ranger didn't bark anymore. He didn't attack the bars. He simply watched, eyes flicking between the man and the doorway. Testing. Assessing. Trying to decide if the quiet in front of him was a trap or a lifeline. Finally, as the clock in the hallway clicked past 7, Ranger curled his body into the corner of the enclosure, not in fear, but in exhaustion. His head rested on his paws. His trembling slowed. Evan knew this was the moment to leave. He rose from the chair slowly, careful not to disturb the fragile thread of trust. Ranger lifted his head at the sound, but didn't growl, didn't retreat, just watched. "Rest, Ranger," Evan whispered. "We'll try again tomorrow." As he stepped toward the door, Sarah whispered, "He trusts you." "Not yet," Evan replied softly. "But he's thinking about it." And thinking was the first door a broken soldier had to open. The morning after Ranger reacted to the German command, Portland woke under a pale blanket of fog that clung to the shelter windows like a quiet omen. Inside the quarantine wing, the fluorescent lights buzzed with the tired hum of a building that had seen too many beginnings end too soon. Evan Carter arrived before the staff clocked in, moving with the determined stillness of a man carrying a private mission. He had shaved for the first time in weeks, though a shadow of stubble still framed his sharp jawline. His blue eyes were clearer today, focused, anchored, not by hope, but by something heavier, responsibility. Ranger rose the moment Evan entered, not snarling, not lunging, but rising slowly, as if the dog sensed a shift in the air. His fur, thick with gray-black layers, bristled along his spine. His posture remained tense, but the trembling had eased. The dog's energy was no longer chaos, it was caution, searching for truth. Before Evan could place the chair down, hurried footsteps echoed behind him. Lily Bennett burst into the room, clutching a plastic sleeve filled with documents. Lily, who worked in intake and administrative tasks, was a young woman in her mid-20s, short, with a round face framed by russet-colored curls. Freckles dotted her cheeks like soft constellations. She normally carried a gentle optimism that made the shelter feel less cold. But today her eyes were swollen from crying, and her hands shook with a mixture of anger and disbelief. "Evan," she breathed, her voice breaking, "you need to see this." Evan turned. Lily's shoulders rose and fell quickly, her small frame rattled by adrenaline. "What happened?" he asked, steadying his voice. Lily held out the sleeve. Inside were forms stamped with government headers, discharge documents, medical logs, transfer records. This was stuffed behind a cabinet," she said, breath trembling. "Someone tossed it like trash. He isn't a stray. He isn't a danger case. He's a military working dog. MWD Ranger, ID A117. Evan took the papers carefully, scanning the pages. Ranger's records told a story written in terse military phrasing. 2 deployments in Afghanistan with a private security contractor, multiple successful detection operations, behavioral marks of high intelligence and extreme environmental sensitivity, traits common in advanced K-9 units. Then the tone shifted. A transfer to a civilian adopter. Notes of aggression. Medical entries about blunt force injuries. Lily wiped at her eyes with her sleeve. His last owner, he wasn't just neglectful, he beat Ranger. The injuries line up, multiple reports filed, and still the city approved the transfer. Evan felt the room tilt slightly. Not from surprise. He had suspected this truth long before he saw the paperwork, but from the weight of confirmation. Ranger wasn't dangerous. Ranger was trained. Ranger was broken by betrayal, not born in violence. Evan's jaw set, muscles tightening at the angle where past fury met present clarity. Before he could speak, another pair of steps approached. The door opened to reveal Deputy Director Howard Grayson, the administrative head of the city's Animal Services Division. Howard was a tall, narrow man in his early 50s with thinning blonde hair combed flat over an expanding bald spot. His face bore a rigid expression carved by years of bureaucracy, not cruelty, but the kind of bureaucratic detachment that kills just as effectively. His suit, a gray two-button jacket slightly too loose for his slim frame, was impeccably pressed. He walked with the clipped efficiency of someone who preferred paperwork to people. "Ms. Bennett," he said curtly, adjusting his glasses, "I need to speak with you regarding your earlier complaint. But first, Mr. Carter." He addressed Evan without warmth. "The city has issued its ruling. The dog is classified as an irredeemable behavioral threat. He will be euthanized in 5 days." Lily inhaled sharply, as if punched. "Sir, you can't. Did you even read his history? He's a veteran service dog." "His past is irrelevant," Howard replied, tone flat. "Our concern is liability. This animal has already inflicted injury and shows signs of unpredictable aggression." Ranger growled softly at the sternness in Howard's voice, ears flattening. But Evan raised a hand subtly, a calming gesture Ranger watched with conflicted understanding. "He's not unpredictable," Evan said, low, steady. "He's traumatized." Howard offered a tight-lipped smile, the kind bureaucrats reserve for those they consider naive. "Trauma does not exempt an animal from regulation. The public expects safety." Lily stepped forward. Though small, she stood between Howard and the kennel with surprising bravery. "But we owe him more than this," she insisted. "He served. He saved lives." Howard clasped his hands behind his back. "And the city served by offering him a chance at civilian adoption. What happened afterward is unfortunate, but not our responsibility." The air seemed to freeze. Evan saw in Howard a familiar type, the ones who made decisions from behind desks untouched by the blood and echoes of the battlefield. Howard continued, "If you, Mr. Carter, wish to file an appeal or request a behavioral reassessment, you may submit—" "No forms," Evan interrupted quietly. "No appeals. I'll fix this myself." Howard blinked. "Meaning?" "I'll rehabilitate him," Evan said. "In 5 days." Lily stared at him, eyes wide with sudden hope. Howard's face twitched with impatience. "Impossible," he said. "Even professionals need weeks, months." "I'm not asking permission," Evan said, locking eyes with him. "I'm telling you what's going to happen." Evan's voice held no bravado. It held truth forged in places Howard had never survived. Howard stiffened, but something in Evan's gaze, the steel, the cold certainty, made him take a step back. "Very well," Howard conceded. "But understand the consequence. If the dog fails the final evaluation, he will be put down immediately. No extensions." He turned sharply and left, the door slamming behind him. Lily exhaled shakily. "Evan, you just challenged the city." "No," he said quietly, looking at Ranger, who watched him through the bars with the golden eyes that flickered between fear and something older. "I made a promise." Ranger shifted, his body lowering to the floor slowly, not collapsing, but leaning, as if the dog sensed the shift in his fate. "We start today," Evan murmured, pulling the chair closer to the kennel, just a foot nearer than before. Ranger's ears lifted, his breathing steadied. "No more cages," Evan whispered. "Not for him, not for me." And for the first time in years, both man and dog recognized a truth they had forgotten. Survival means nothing without someone to return for. The storm rolled into Portland like a wounded beast, dragging a wall of wind and thunder across the city just as evening settled. Clouds hung low and swollen, heavy with lightning that flashed bright enough to turn the shelter's metal fences into jagged silver silhouettes. Inside the nearly empty building, Evan Carter stood in the quarantine wing with a calm determination. Today was supposed to be the day. They needed the recording showing Ranger wearing a muzzle and walking on leash without panic. 5 days had become 3. Time was collapsing. Ranger had made surprising progress. He no longer threw himself at the cage walls, and he had allowed Evan to rest a soft muzzle against his snout through the bars. Now, for the first time, Evan planned to step inside the kennel. He waited beside the door, breathing with quiet focus, letting the dog hear and feel the steadiness in his chest. But the storm had other plans. A deafening crack of thunder tore the air open. The metal roof trembled. Ranger jolted upright, pupils exploding with terror. His entire frame shook violently, his ears flattened so tightly they disappeared into his fur. Evan froze, recognizing the shift instantly. This wasn't fear, this was flashback. The storm outside became mortar fire inside Ranger's mind. "Ranger," Evan whispered, raising a steady hand. "Easy, boy." But another blast of thunder collided with the building, louder and closer, rattling the lights. Ranger screamed, an animal sound born from trauma, not aggression. Before Evan could get the gate fully secured, the dog surged upward in a violent burst of raw survival instinct. Metal groaned, hinges strained, and in a single desperate lunge, Ranger rammed the weakened kennel door. The latch, already compromised from his earlier panic attacks, snapped with a metallic shriek. Ranger bolted. He didn't look at Evan, didn't look at anyone. He ran as if the world behind him were on fire. Evan chased him through the hallway, his boots slamming on the concrete, but Ranger was faster, guided by sheer terror. The dog leapt at the double doors, squeezing through the narrow gap left by a faulty latch, and plunged into the night just as rain crashed down like shattered glass. Evan sprinted to the entrance, but Ranger was gone, a gray shadow swallowed by the storm. Behind him, someone shouted. Officer Travis Red, the city patrolman assigned for overnight emergency calls, stood near the parking lot, gripping a shotgun in both hands. Travis was a large man in his late 30s, broad shoulders and a sturdy build shaped from years of wrestling with troublemakers. His square jaw was shadowed with 5 o'clock stubble, and a long scar ran from his right eyebrow to his temple. An old injury from a dog attack during a domestic call years ago. It left him wary, quick to see danger in canine eyes where others saw fear. "He's loose!" Travis shouted, his voice cracking with both adrenaline and buried fear. "That's a Class 4 threat, Carter. That dog will kill someone." "He's running from the storm, not toward people," Evan yelled back. "Put the gun down." But lightning flashed, so close it lit Travis's face in a mask of fear and memory. His hand tightened around the gun. "I'm not letting him maul another officer," he said, voice low but shaking. "I won't survive that again." Evan understood instantly. Travis wasn't hunting Ranger. Travis was running from his own ghosts. Evan didn't waste another second. He leapt into his truck, turned the ignition, and tore out of the lot as rain hammered the windshield so violently he could barely see the road. His breath came hard and fast. The storm was too familiar, too loud, too much like the nights he tried endlessly to forget. But he forced himself forward. "Not again," he muttered, jaw locked. "I'm not losing another one." The city blurred by. Flooding gutters, flickering streetlights, branches whipping across asphalt. Evan drove with the instinct of a man who had hunted in darkness before. He scanned alleys, empty lots, abandoned industrial yards. Anywhere a terrified dog would flee to hide. Then he saw it, the shadow of a construction site ahead. Towering steel frames twisted against the lightning-lit sky. A place full of echoes, a place full of holes, a place where a dog could fall. He braked hard, skidding across gravel. The storm roared around him. "Ranger!" he shouted into the wind. No answer. Then a distant, pained howl cut through the thunder. Evan sprinted toward the sound. weaving through rusted beams and stacks of concrete blocks slick with rain. His heart hammered harder with each step, not from exertion, but from fear. The same fear he once felt running toward an explosion because he knew someone was trapped beneath it. He reached the edge of a jagged concrete pit. 10 feet down, in a dark hollow where rebar jutted like broken bones, lay Ranger. The dog whimpered as he tried to move, his back leg pinned between two rusted metal rods. His fur was soaked, plastered to his trembling frame. His breaths came sharp and fast. His eyes flicked upward, wild, terrified, but when they locked onto Evan, something softened. Evan dropped to his knees at the pit's edge, rain soaking his clothes. "Hey, buddy," he murmured, voice low and steady. "I'm here. I've got you." Ranger whimpered again, then tried to pull back, but the trapped limb made him cry out in pain. The sound cut through Evan like shrapnel. He scanned the pit. The sides were slick, almost vertical, but a narrow slope of debris on the left might hold enough weight. He didn't think twice. He slid down, boots skidding on wet rubble, catching himself on jagged edges. When he reached Ranger, he crouched low, palms open, showing the dog every inch of his presence. "Easy," Evan whispered. "You're not alone anymore." Ranger bared his teeth, not at Evan, but at the pain, but he didn't snap, not once. Evan reached for the trapped leg, moving slow, deliberate. The dog's trembling grew as Evan touched the rebar. "I know," Evan murmured. "I know it hurts." He pushed the metal aside, freeing the leg. Ranger collapsed into him, his weight pressing against Evan's chest. It wasn't aggression, it wasn't instinct. It was surrender. Evan wrapped his arms around the dog's thick neck, his forehead pressed to Ranger's head. Rain dripped from his hair onto the dog's fur. The world roared above them, but down in the pit, everything felt painfully still. "You're safe," Evan whispered, voice cracking. "Not losing you, not again." Ranger's trembling eased. He lifted his head and pressed it into Evan's chest, hard, seeking shelter in the only place that had not betrayed him. Evan closed his eyes, breathing through the ache in his ribs, holding the dog who mirrored his own broken past. Above them, thunder boomed once more, but this time neither ran. The morning after the storm felt like the world had been washed clean. Portland lay under a pale winter sky, its usual gray softened into a faint silver that clung to rooftops and street signs. The air was crisp, steady, and still, the kind of cold that made breath drift like smoke but also sharpened every sound. Evan Carter guided Ranger down the last stretch of the muddy construction path, one hand gripping his improvised belt lead, the other pressed lightly against the dog's shoulder to steady him. Ranger limped on 3 legs, soaked, exhausted, but upright, and, crucially, walking beside Evan without resistance. His thick German Shepherd coat, usually a storm of motion and tension, now clung wetly to his frame, revealing the athletic lines of a military-bred body beneath. His fur was mottled sable and ash, his face rugged with a dark muzzle and intelligent amber eyes that flicked constantly to Evan with a look that hovered somewhere between pain and trust. They emerged from the tree line and onto the gravel clearing where the small group waited. Rain-washed sunlight slanted across the lot, catching the shine of patrol cars, mud-spattered boots, and the stunned faces of those who had been holding their breath since dawn. Lily Bennett was the first to step forward. The young vet tech, with her shoulder-length auburn hair plastered damp against her cheeks and her soft brown eyes swollen from a sleepless night, pressed both hands to her mouth. Normally bright and animated, Lily looked almost fragile now, the events of the storm having carved worry into her features. But when she saw Ranger walking, calm, steady, her expression fractured into relief. "Oh my God," she whispered, voice trembling. "Evan, he's walking with you." Evan gave a small nod, breath still scraping from the climb. He chose to. Behind her, Shelter Director Mark Hanlon stepped closer. Mark was a man in his late 40s with a solid, fatherly build and a salt-and-pepper beard trimmed neatly along a square jaw. His eyes, usually narrowed with administrative fatigue, now softened with something between awe and pride. Mark had the composure of a former cop who'd seen the best and worst of people, but he'd carried a quiet fear all morning that they were too late. One look at Ranger, and the tension eased from his shoulders. "Well," Mark said in a low, steady voice, "I'll be damned. That's remarkable." Ranger paused a moment beside Evan, lowering his head to sniff the gravel before leaning back against his leg. The dog's injured hind leg trembled, pain evident, but he stayed in place. No lunging, no frantic pacing, no exploding at the sight of strangers. Travis Red stood farther back, leaning against the side of his patrol truck. The scar on his temple showed sharply under the new daylight. His rifle was long put away, and now the fear that once hardened his posture had softened into something like conflicted respect. Travis was a big man, but at this moment he somehow looked smaller, like a soldier relieved that the battle he expected never arrived. He didn't speak, but he gave Evan the faintest nod. A truce, possibly the beginning of something like redemption. It was Mark who moved first. "Let's get him inside," he said, voice gentling. "Lily, prep the clinic. I want that leg cleaned, wrapped, and x-rayed. Evan." He paused, gaze shifting to the improvised belt lead. "We'll need video confirmation. Are you up for that?" Evan glanced down at Ranger, who met his eyes with a worn, resolute steadiness. "Yeah," Evan murmured. "We're ready." Lily sprinted ahead, pushing through the glass door into the shelter's clinic wing. Evan followed at a careful pace, Ranger limping beside him, his body radiating warmth through the cold morning air. Inside, the shelter was unusually quiet. Even the usually barking dogs in the adoption wing seemed subdued, as if the storm had wrung the noise out of them. Lily returned with a clean, professionally fitted muzzle, the kind used for MWD evaluations. She held it gently in both hands, her voice soft. "Evan, if he's not ready, we can—" "He's ready," Evan said. "Aren't you, buddy?" He knelt beside Ranger, movement slow and deliberate. Ranger flinched at the sight of the muzzle but didn't back away. Evan held the muzzle near his own chest first, showing calm, showing no fear. "It's not a threat," he whispered. "Just a tool. Just something we do together." Ranger's ears flicked back, uncertain, but his tail gave a single slow wag. Evan slid the muzzle forward. Ranger dipped his head, hesitated, and then allowed the muzzle to slip over his snout. It clicked into place with a soft metallic snap. Lily exhaled shakily. Mark muttered, "That's one miracle." Evan stood, clipped a clean leash to Ranger's collar, and lifted the phone Mark handed him. He pressed record. "Ranger," Evan said gently, "heel." The dog moved. Not with perfect precision, not with polished obedience, but with trust. Ranger walked beside him down the corridor, muzzle on, leash loose, head held steady. It lasted 23 seconds. That was all the city needed. Proof of manageability. But to those watching, it felt like watching a soul resurrect itself. When Evan stopped the recording, Lily wiped tears with the back of her sleeve. "He's saved," she whispered. "He really is saved." Mark clapped a hand on Evan's shoulder. "You did something no one here thought was possible." Evan shook his head slowly. "No, he did it. I just stopped running long enough to see him." Ranger nudged Evan's leg with his muzzle, the gesture soft and almost playful despite the pain in his injured limb. Lily guided Ranger into the clinic, speaking softly as she prepared the sedative for his leg x-rays. Mark stayed behind with Evan. "Listen," Mark said, leaning his weight on the counter. "Portland Animal Recovery has been running on fumes for years. Dogs like Ranger, most don't get second chances." He folded his arms. "But you gave us something we don't get often. Hope. Real hope." Evan looked at him, puzzled. Mark continued. "We want you here, not just for Ranger, though that dog clearly worships the ground you walk on. We need someone who understands trauma the way you do. Someone who doesn't give up." Evan's throat tightened. "Mark, I'm not exactly built for people." "Good thing most of your patients have 4 legs," Mark said with a half smile. "We can offer housing, too. The old caretaker's cottage out back. Needs some work, but it's yours if you want it." Evan hesitated. For 6 years, he had lived in near silence. Just him, an empty cabin, and a war he never stopped fighting. But in the last 3 days, with a broken German shepherd leaning on him as though he were the last steady place in the world, he felt alive again. "I'll think about it," Evan said quietly. "Take your time," Mark replied, though his smile suggested he already knew the answer. By late afternoon, Ranger emerged from the clinic with a clean wrap on his leg and a prescription for rest. When Evan stepped toward him, Ranger limped straight into him, pressing his head under Evan's hand. "Yeah," Evan murmured, scratching behind his ear. "We're staying." Winter crept slowly into Portland in the weeks that followed. The caretaker cottage behind the shelter was small but warm, with a newly mended fence and a tiny porch that caught the morning sun. Ranger claimed that porch like a throne, lying with his paws stretched forward, ears perked at the sound of other wounded dogs being brought in. Each morning, Evan stepped outside with a mug of black coffee, Ranger rising to nudge his knee as if to remind him, "Hey, we survived this. Together." They had been broken, one man, one dog, but now they were something else entirely. Survivors, partners, and slowly, carefully, they were learning how to walk toward the light again. When their long journey finally came to rest, it felt as if a quiet miracle had unfolded. One of those small, invisible works of grace that God places in the world when no one is looking. Evan and Ranger were not saved by strength or skill alone, but by a mercy that slips into ordinary days, guiding broken hearts toward each other until something sacred begins to heal. In their struggle, we see our own lives, the storms we fear, the wounds we carry, and the unexpected moments when help arrives like a whisper from heaven. If their story touched you, share it with someone who might need hope today. Leave a comment with your own experiences. Subscribe so you never miss another journey, and may God bless you and keep you in every step you take.